Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me for our Advent Adult Forum. This year, we're going to spend some time each week exploring the backstory and meaning of some of my favorite Christmas carols. To start us off, I'd like to take a look at the hymn, It Came Upon the Midnight Clear. While this isn't usually a popular choice for all-time favorite Christmas song, I think it has a lot to say to us during this difficult year we've had. The hymn was written by a Unitarian pastor named Edmund Sears in Wayland, Massachusetts in 1849, and it was published as a poem in the Christian Register in Boston on December 29, 1849. There are many differences between Unitarians and Lutherans, but the biggest is that Unitarians affirm that God is one entity, in contrast to Trinitarians who believe that God is three in one. They also don't believe in original sin or the total depravity of humanity that Luther espoused. Unitarians believe that humans are capable of choosing good or evil. Unitarians also generally hold to what is called low Christology. That is, Jesus is not God, but serves as a moral authority and example of how we ought to live. Edmund Sears, the writer of our hymn, however, broke with his tradition on this particular point and did believe that Jesus is fully divine and fully human. Edmund Sears had grown up on a farm, studied law for 9 months, and then moved on to study theology at Harvard Divinity School, the alma mater of our very own Pastor Bob. After graduation, Sears traveled as a missionary to the frontier lands of the West, finding himself serving mostly in and around Toledo, Ohio. He was later called back to Massachusetts to serve as the parish pastor of First Congregation Church and Society. His poem, It Came Upon the Midnight Clear, was written during a time of personal melancholy for Sears, but it can also be firmly placed within the global context of his time. A series of revolutions were taking place all around the world, and the Mexican-American War, seen by many, including a newly elected congressman named Abraham Lincoln, as nothing but a bloody land grab, had just ended. The tune that Americans know today was written in 1850 by Richard Storrs, and the lyrics in this tune appear together for the first time in the Methodist hymnal in 1879. But the hymn wasn't popularized until World War I and World War II among American troops fighting in Europe. We'll probably see why in a little bit when we look at the verses. The inclusion of this hymn in hymnals is still controversial even to this day. Even more than a century later, it is still being criticized. For example, British carol scholar, yes, that is a real job title, British carol scholar Eric Routley said of this hymn, in its original form, the hymn is little more than an ethical song extolling the worth and splendor of peace among men. Robert Guy McCutcheon, on the other hand, wrote, "It is one of the first of the carol-like hymns that seem to have sprung from American poets. Hymns stressing the social message of Christmas, peace on earth, goodwill toward men, are distinctly American." While it is true that It Came Upon the Midnight Clear does not use the words God or Jesus, I think Eric Routley is missing some important points in dismissing it. Let's take a quick look at some of the verses so that I can share some of my thoughts. Verse 1 references the well-known story of the shepherds watching their flocks by night. They were suddenly surprised by the arrival of angels with an important message for them. Peace on the earth, goodwill to all from heaven's all-gracious King. This year, perhaps more than any other in recent memory, reminds us of the tension we experience between this message of peace and the realities of this world. But our understanding of the incarnation, of the arrival of the God-man on earth, reminds us that the work of God that began in a manger in Bethlehem and went to the cross and the empty tomb will someday culminate in all of God's children being gathered to God. It is right, said one of the sources I read in my research, that we should joyfully sing, "Hark the herald angels sing," and joy to the world each Christmas season. But always there are moments when we realize the message of peace has not yet been fully realized on earth. Then we sing, "It came upon the midnight clear," and the power of the incarnation and the message of the gospel touch us even more deeply. While not traditionally included in hymnals and not found in our own ELW hymnal, there is a fifth verse that should appear as verse 3 in the song that I think is important and particularly helpful to us this year as we reflect. Because it's unfamiliar, I'll read it. Yet with the woes of sin and strife, the world has suffered long. Beneath the angel strain have rolled 2,000 years of wrong. And man, at war with man, hears not the love song which they bring. Oh, hush the noise, ye men of strife, and hear the angels sing. Edmund Sears certainly experienced or heard about his fair share of strife and war in his lifetime. In 1848, 1 year before he wrote this hymn, democratic revolutions took place all across Europe and Latin America with the aim of removing old feudal systems. They all followed the same pattern of a disaffected middle class led by reformers who demanded more participation in government and freedom of the press, followed by a reactionary movement of the royalty, aristocracy, army, and peasants regaining control as the revolutions collapsed. This pattern began in February in France and involved more than 50 countries around the world, all within the same calendar year. And if that's not enough war and strife, America had its own fair share too. As I mentioned previously, the Mexican-American War had just ended when Sears wrote "It Came Upon the Midnight Clear." The war-ending Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo forced Mexico to give up territory that now encompasses California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Additionally, the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention took place in 1848, giving us an early glimpse of the famous suffragettes who would fight for the right to vote. Edmund Sears believed in the equality of men and women and would have supported at least the spirit of this convention, though perhaps he would not have appreciated all of the different tactics supported by some of the suffragettes over the course of the women's suffrage movement. On top of all of that, Sears was also living and writing in the midst of a pandemic. Between 1832 and 1849, more than 150,000 Americans died of cholera. Perhaps verse 4 is a nod to those people who suffered then and who are suffering now. And then, of course, there was the big issue in America at the time, slavery. After the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, Edmund Sears declared from his pulpit that when the human and the divine law were in conflict, it was the duty of all to obey the latter. Every time we have dallied with slave power, we have sown the wind, and every year it becomes more certain that we shall reap the whirlwind. While not strictly a prophet, Sears could see where all of this was going, and the Civil War that broke out little more than a decade later proved him right. But even among all of this pain and hardship and death and hatred, Sears could see hope. Verse 5 brings us around to what Sears hopes we can all take away from the song. Hope in a future where peace will reign and all humanity will sing back the song of peace that God sings to us. For now, though, our life is a perpetual time of Advent, of waiting for the coming and of celebrating in anticipation of what will one day be. We can strive to realize the peace that the angels promise, but we know that our work will only be completed in God's time and with God's intervention. In a world that seems even more troubled today than it was in 1849, and when our fears and worries are great, this is a hymn to be sung with understanding. Probably more than any other Christmas carol, it talks about today, whether his day or our day. It calls us to see the state of our world with clear eyes, to listen for the song of peace and goodwill that is ringing out for those who have ears to hear, and to respond as we are able with faith in a God who will bring that promise to fruition. Thanks for joining me today.